Hello students, welcome to EPE Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. Today we are going to talk on module Urban Policy Paradigms from paper Sociology of Urban Transformations. So students, let us see what we are going to learn in this module. In this module, we will provide a historical backdrop for understanding contemporary urban policy. We will also analyze urban policy on themes such as regional development and institutional frameworks for master planning. Lastly, we critically overview some of the recent flagship programs of the government, such as the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission. In other modules, we have looked at urban policy in domains of basic services, citizen partnership or participations, small towns, and others. This module attempts to provide a historical background and analytical framework for urban policy and discuss important themes that have not been able to address in the previous module, such as the institutions of planning and urban employment. As we have discussed, the level of urbanization has gradually increased after independence. Currently, around 31% of total Indian population live in cities. Many of them are recent addition in the cities. A large proportion of population finds its habitation in informal settlements such as the slums. We also know that Indian cities suffer from acute deficiency of basic and social infrastructure. The successive governments have been initiating programs to address issues of services. The policy perspective was added by the colonial administration in order to keep the city atmosphere healthy, pure, and sanitized, though it had its own ramifications. At the time of independence, the proportion of the urban population was even lower. Only about 1/7 of the India's population lived in urban areas at the time. It is no surprise that Indian cities were slow in coming to the attention of both academics and policy makers before the idea of the urban turn became popular. Indeed, in some ways, the earliest policy approach to the urban cohered in the 5-year plans. Annapurna Shaw notes that the focus was on capital accumulation in the modern sector, which was disproportionately centered in the cities and particularly the metropolises. Therefore, this module begins with a close examination of the themes and concerns that shaped the first few decades, that is post-independence, through the lens of the 5-year plans, and looking at, in particular, at how the institutional framework for urban planning and policy, that is, the knowledge edifice and the institutional edifice, was shaped. We also look at how the plans addressed questions of regional development and urban poverty and employment. The first section provides an understanding of the urban policy in a thematic and chronological perspective, starting from development of urban areas that were flooded with refugees in the post-partition to the development of small towns as counter magnets to the fast-growing major cities. The next section critically examines the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, and we conclude with an overview of recent policy initiatives. So, what were the urban priorities and institutions of planning in the 5-year plans? The urban turn that we spoke in module 1 has some implication for us here. The urban turn in scholarly research and policy making was long in coming, but one may ask, what were some of the constraints and concerns that shaped the policy stand towards the urban in the prior period? Annapurna Shaw, she makes certain important points. One, that urban policy and planning are subjects on the state list. So thus, more than an exercise of constitutionally allocated legislative power, the 5-year plans which were framed by the central government of India only provided directives on urban policy. The guiding imperatives for urban policy and planning has been the requirement of capital accumulation for economic development. Keep this point in mind because we are going to come back to this one in the later in lecture. Thus, for example, the crisis in capital accumulation in the 1960s led to greater policy focus on the urban, which was already the major contributor to the country's annual output. The period of the first and second 5-year plans, that is from 1951 to 1961, in India's political economy was marked by the partition, and which, in the words of Sanyal, was one of the largest mass displacements of people in contemporary history. As refugees flooded into India, both from East and West Pakistan, there was need for work as a shelter. Their need for work and shelter threatened to overwhelm both central and state governments and cities such as Delhi and Calcutta. Refugee camps such as Kingsway Camp in Delhi and Cooper's Camp outside Calcutta were set up to house these new arrivals, but they all proved inadequate. Large numbers had to resort to squatting when camp life and emergency living over the long term became unviable. Sanyal notes in an aside that in Delhi, areas that are today considered middle class and upmarket, such as Malviya Nagar, Kalkaji, and Lajpat Nagar, were used by the Ministry of Rehabilitation to rehouse refugees. This period was important also because it saw the beginnings of an institutional setup for the management of urban administration and the creation of pool of skilled professionals that were to come to define the urban policy paradigm in later years. The influence of these organizations in shaping a particular vision of rational urban development and land management has influenced Indian cities into the present also. The first such organization was the Ministry of Works, Housing and Supply, which facilitated speedy spatial and occupational rehabilitation of refugees. This ministry facilitated a large number of rehabilitation colonies in Delhi, Bombay, Ahmedabad, Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Punjab, and Calcutta. Around the same time, organizations such as School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi, National Building Organization, and Town and Country Planning Organization were set up in 1941, 1952, 54, and 1962, respectively. Initial urban policies were based on Town and Country Planning Act 1947 of Britain, and a Model Town Planning Act was prepared in 1957 by the Town and Country Planning Organization. The master plan became a key instrument for guiding urban growth in Delhi. The Delhi Development Authority was created under an act of the same name in 1957. It confers the power of land acquisition, holding, and disposing the properties to the DDA. The master plan incorporates various proposed uses of land in the form of zoning, reservation of land for public purpose uses, earmarking roads and railway network, schedule of implementation and development control regulations, and so on. Proposed land use puts each parcel of land under a specific land use category. It also provides a legal binding for development of a particular land parcel for a particular category of land use. Nonetheless, as Annapurna Shaw has argued, the effect of these ideas was also that the application of policy often failed to see the urban as an organic whole rooted in the local culture. Batra argues that the master planning approach often relied on uncritical import from the then prevalent town planning and regulatory practices in Britain and the United States of America. Around the same time, Planning-related legislations were enacted in the states, and the master plans for other major cities were prepared. The state capitals of Gandhinagar and Bhubaneswar were developed. To continue to provide housing for the urban poor, in 1970, during the fourth plan period, the Housing and Urban Development Corporation was set up. This organization aimed to provide loans to urban development authorities and state housing boards for housing and other development projects such as infrastructure development, land acquisition, and essential services. In 1985, under the leadership of Charles Correa, the National Commission of Urbanization was formed, which emphasized the need for spatial planning as a component of sectoral planning. It was a landmark event that would define later urban policy frameworks. It also preceded the introduction of the 74th Constitutional Amendment that we have discussed in Module 6.1. The 74th Constitutional Amendment consisted of devolution and decentralization of urban planning functions to urban local bodies as a third tier of government, making them viable units of self-governance. So the second five-year plan gave an early recognition of the role of planning beyond the purview of the city. As slums were proliferating, the concept of the regional plan was introduced in the second five-year plan. However, the major fillip came in the period of 1961 to 66, that is during the third five-year plan, which recognized the need for balanced spatial and demographic development. The idea of city region as a concept that were used by economists and urban planners was used to note a metropolitan area and its hinterland that was usually divided administratively but with shared resources and markets. The concept of regional development is based on the development of such city regions as well as regions which have been bypassed by development as a whole, such as tribal areas. The major objective of the regional development is to remove regional disparities in respect of economic and social development and bring out the region at par with other regions of the country. This is different from social, economic, and physical planning. The efforts to promote balanced regional development continued in the period of 1969 to 74, that is during the fourth five-year plan. The plan stressed the need to prevent further the growth of population in large cities and need for decongestion or dispersal of population. This was envisaged to be achieved by creation of smaller towns and by planning the spatial location of economic activity. Urban regional development authorities was created, such as Mumbai Metropolitan Region Development Authority, the Madras Metropolitan Development Authority, and others. It is important to note that like the DDA, these new authorities were also responsible for implementing the respective master plans in these cities. A major strategy adopted during this period was the development of small and medium towns. In 1975, a task force was set up for the development of small and medium towns, followed by the scheme of integrated development of small and medium towns that was launched in towns with population below 1 lakh for provision of roads, pavements, minor civic works, bus stands, markets, shopping complex, etc. It proposed setting up new industries and commercial and professional establishments in small, medium, and intermediate towns. Regional development continued to be emphasized in later plans, including the 6th and 7th plans. In the 7th plan period, the coverage of the scheme was extended to 102 additional towns. The plan reiterated the need to integrate town-level plans into the regional system. Thus, in 1985, the National Capital Region Planning Board was formed to reduce population pressure on Delhi by dispersing and diverting population and economic activity to other urban centers within the National Capital Region, thereby ensuring the balanced development of the region as a whole. As the need for planned urban development grew, the need for developed land became an pressing issue, especially after the 5th five-year plan. According to Ahluwalia, planned development of Indian cities have been greatly hampered by the lack of a properly functioning land markets that are based on clear property rights, ease in transacting the purchase or sale of land, effective enforcement of contracts to buy and sell developed properties, and transparent rules and regulations for redeveloping land and or property. A major reason for distortion of land markets is legislation in respect of urban land ceiling and rent control, which has led to large areas in central cities being upheld from coming into the market for redevelopment. One such legislation is the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act, which was enacted in 1976 to prevent concentration of land holding in urban areas and to make available urban land for construction of houses for the middle and low income groups. Promulgated as a social equity measure during the period of suspension of civil liberties known as the emergency, the act was pretty much in tune with the larger economic policy of land reforms adopted by Indira Gandhi in 1970s, as it was felt that during this period, private dealings were leading to land speculation and profiteering. Joshi points out that over the 23 years, the ULCRA, that is Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act, was in force, and only 9% of the excess vacant and vested land could be acquired physically. The Urban Land Ceiling Act 1976 failed to meet its objective. There was no incentive for individual landowners to declare his land, as rates of compensation were very low. Moreover, state governments allowed landowners a variety of exemptions to avoid giving up excess land. To the extent it worked, it had adverse impacts on restricting the supply of urban land by reserving too much for public purposes and directing it to purposes that it deemed fit. Evidence is limited that land so acquired was used for the urban poor. Since this law enabled the government to possess large amounts of land at its disposal, it artificially created a scarcity of precious urban land. Scholars came to view the act as a major obstacle to urban development. Others, such as Narayan, went further to argue that large landowners, big builders, and developers were among the biggest beneficiaries of the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act, with about 20 builders having monopolized apartment construction in Greater Mumbai by the mid-1980s. Since Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act has not met its intended objectives, the Government of India decided to repeal the Act with the passing of the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Repeal Act 1999. Various states subsequently repealed the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act, though Narayan notes that only a few had done so by 2002. Repeal of the ULCRA, that is the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act, has been included as one of the mandatory reforms suggested in Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, that is JNNURM. States have committed to repealing it within a committed time frame. It is envisaged that a repeal of the legislation would go a long way in reviving the stagnant housing industry and facilitate construction of dwelling units both in the public and private sector. The Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, a scheme that was initiated in 1989, aimed to provide employment to unemployed through setting up of micro enterprises and wage employment, but it yielded disappointing results. However, the most prominent scheme launched by the Indian government to improve the livelihood services of the urban poor was the Swarna Jayanti Shahri Rozgar Yojana, that is SJSRY, in 1997, who subsumed the earlier policies also. The SJSRY is the only urban poverty alleviation program of the Government of India, catering to the livelihood needs of the below poverty line urban population. It prescribes identification of the poorest of the poor beneficiaries among the BPL population. In 2013, the SJSRY was restructured as the National Urban Livelihood Mission. The mission aims to cover 786 cities in its first phase under the 12th plan, enabling urban poor to access gainful self-employment and skilled wage employment. The mission would also address livelihood concerns of the urban street vendors by facilitating access to suitable spaces, institutional credit, and social security. So we have seen that in the 5-year plans, a regional dimension was added to the planning of urban. But the period of liberalization that started after 1992 brought in a sea change in urban policy. It saw reduction of import tariffs and higher level of foreign investment and transformation in center-state relationships also. The economic model that allowed greater freedom to states vis-a-vis the center launched a new phase of interstate competition for private investment and state governments to elaborate their own policies, for instance, with regard to economic development initiatives. Moreover, the major cities came to be positioned as engines for economic growth by state governments. As you may recall, in some ways, this emphasis simply echoed the policy focus in the plan period on cities as sites of capital accumulation. However, as Mahadevia noted in an early comment on the JNNURM, that what distinguishes the new policy regime was the idea of world-class city making to be realized through international standard infrastructure, particularly roads, airports, public transport, open spaces, and real estate projects. In 2005, JNNURM, the largest central government initiative in urban development, was announced. It covers 63 million plus cities, state capitals, as well as other important cities. The thrust of the JNNURM was to ensure improvement in urban governance and service delivery so that urban local bodies become financially sound and sustainable for undertaking new programs. It is for that reason also described as reform-linked initiative scheme that support state governments and urban local bodies. The focus is to be on efficiency in urban infrastructure and service delivery mechanisms, community participation and accountability of urban local bodies or parastatal agencies towards the citizens. In these mission cities, the JNNURM included two submissions. One, urban infrastructure and governance, and two, basic services to the urban poor. Development of small and medium towns continued to be an important theme. The 11th plan introduced a focus on small towns through the submission for urban infrastructure development of small and medium towns in the JNNURM project. The program also included submissions programs focused on urban poverty, something like the basic services for urban poor, an integrated housing and slum development program that is called IHSDP. The major objective of these submissions was to construct dwelling units for the poor and also provide basic services like drinking water, sanitation, sewerage, etc. to the people. The mandated and optional series of reforms included implementation of decentralization measures of the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act and the introduction of e-governance for property tax collection so as to achieve at least 85% collection efficiency within 5 years, and introduction of similar practices in the case of financial accounting systems, work management, water tax billing and collection system, trade licensing system, and passing of building plans, repeal of Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act reforms, of rent control law, rationalization of stamp duty, introduction of independent regulators for urban services and transfer, and over a period of 5 years, all special agencies that deliver civic services in urban areas to urban local bodies. As Mahadevia notes, these preconditions have come in for considerable criticism. Even though the world-class city trope has been the driving idea behind the JNNURM, is it the only benchmark for the mission's success? This question you can ask. This is the question that Mahadevia also asked. However, Gera et al.'s argument that urban policy in India must be evaluated against the paradigm of the right to the city, and it becomes pertinent also. So let us quote Harvey and let us see how the right of the city is more than it is more the right to the city is more than right to access urban resources. It is also the right, in fact, the right to the city is also the right to change the city through democratic control and citizen participation. The right to the city is a powerful political concept, and it can it serve as a benchmark against to evaluate the JNURM. Policy analysts and scholars have highlighted the background against which the JNNURM has unfolded. First is the democratization of the urban governance that is implicated in the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. A major critique of the mission remained that the investments in urban infrastructure have not always resulted in corresponding improvements in the levels of service delivery. In terms of its implementation, despite its unique governance mechanisms, most of the states or urban local bodies were not able to implement all the 23 reforms, particularly relating to city planning functions. Far more problematic from a right to the city perspective may be the full recovery, introduction of private participation, and making land management flexible. Assessing the conditionalities and emphasis on user charges, as well as the reliance on public-private partnerships, Mukhopadhyay sounds a dissenting note to this line of critique, noting that with sufficient accountability and strengthening of institutions, these features may empower city residents. More troublesome in his view is the separation of poor and non-poor, a gap that also applies to the mission's treatment of infrastructure and services, mission cities and small towns, and in many ways undermining between these target groups. In a widely cited critique of the JNNURM, Mahadevia echoes this critique, arguing that perhaps the most critical shortcoming of the mission has been its fragmented goals. A little bit of this and a little bit of that. In many ways, such an approach represents the very antithesis of the mission aimed at rapid city transformation. The JNNURM may have been a mixed bag, but Mahadevia sees a silver lining and says the urban reality has been gradual improvement in the cities, with or without the JNNURM. The question then becomes important: how can urban policy help advance this gradual augmentation of household level and settlement level amenities? Or in other words, how can it help consolidate the right to the city? Post 2005, infrastructure development and its financing was highlighted in the two major reports by Sankhi et al., McKinsey Global Institute, and the second one by high-powered expert committee report chaired by Isar Ahluwalia. According to Ahluwalia, India's economic growth momentum cannot be sustained if urbanization is not actively facilitated. The challenge of managing urbanization will have to be addressed through a combination of increased investment, strengthening the framework for governance and financing, and a comprehensive capacity building program at all levels of government. Another influential report, titled India's Urban Awakening by Sankhi et al., similarly highlighted the importance of infrastructure building, financing, and better governance. The theme of competitive federalism and new modes of financing infrastructure development and governance is continued in the new programs launched in 2014. These include the Smart Cities, Amrit initiatives, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and Heritage City Development and Augmentation Yojana, that is called as Hriday. However, as these schemes are fairly new, a body of scholarly evaluation is yet to emerge, although the Smart Cities scheme and Swachh Bharat have received much attention. So let us see what we have covered in this module. We have seen that how the issues of urban planning was instituted by successive governments in post-independence period. But the focus has been shifting, and at the same time, the ambit of the concerns and issues have been enlarging also. So lastly, we can say that the success of any program lies in its capacity to bring in changes in the life of people, and in particular the underprivileged and the disadvantaged communities. Thank you.